Let's begin then. Colonialism and imperialism. So colonialism is a practice, imperialism is the ideology that drives the practice, which is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country and exploiting it economically. There's no reason for colonialism to exist, really, except for the economic advantages that it conveys. Because otherwise, it's just a big pain. In virtually every case, you've got significant resistance on the part of the native population that's being colonized. And so this requires, as noted at the bottom of the slide, it requires the imposition of force, which is costly, not only in dollars, but in bodies. People get killed. And not just the other side. You know, you as a colonizer are likely to have your people killed as well, although, you know, almost always in fewer numbers. There's a subset of colonialism called settler colonialism. And this is when the imperializing nation transfers its own population to the new territory. So this is the minority version of colonialism. And outside of Europe today, the white majority countries are all settler colonial states. United States, Canada, South Africa, which doesn't have a white majority but nevertheless has a significant white population, Australia and New Zealand are all states that were created under the principle of settler colonialism. But also, it could be argued, and I think is argued, that significant portions of Latin America, if not, in fact, the entire thing, are also the outcome of settler colonialism, just with significantly less complete expulsion or eradication of the native population and a significantly greater amount of intermixing of populations. If you know anything about the population of Central and South America, you'll know that it is significantly ethnically, racially mixed, with the exception really of Argentina, which is like sort of a pure settler colonial state. I mentioned this in a previous class, but empires by their very nature require minority rule. You will most often have a ruling elite from the capital of wherever the political power that does the colonizing exists, and then a significant majority of non-members of that group. So in ancient times, Greek rule over Egypt, Cleopatra, for instance, was actually Greek. She was a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, whereas the population at large in Egypt was not. We've mentioned several times Turkish rule over the Arab population of the world, with the exception of Morocco, what's today Morocco. The rest of the Arab states were ruled from Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which is today Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. And Austrian rule over the Slavic population in Europe, or at least a significant proportion of it, with the Austrians being a German-speaking population centered in Vienna, but ruling over not just the Slavic population, but also Romanians and Hungarians as well. So these are the sort of the general parameters of what we're talking about when we're talking about colonialism and imperialism. Now, it's also true that colonialism and imperialism go back significantly further than where we start on our timeline at 1492. You are probably aware that there were ancient empires like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Hittites, and for that matter, the Chinese had empires. The Chinese were ruled twice by empires from outside of China, first by Mongols and then by Manchus. So colonialism itself is not new. It's something that's been happening for a very long time. What is significant as of 1492 is that it becomes intercontinental. And this is a major sort of watershed, historically speaking. There was limited contact of Europeans with the Americas before 1492, but beginning in 1492, there was permanent conquest and extensive interaction between populations. As you're probably aware, Columbus is Italian, but he's sent by Spain. He's actually sent to find a passage to India. And the reason why he's sent to find a passage to India, just to clarify this point, is that here's India, here's Spain, and you have to go all the way around here to get to India, right? You got to go all the way around it's called the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. That's a lengthy voyage and dangerous. But what makes it significantly more difficult? The alternative, by the way, is that you can go over land to the you can sail to the Palestine and hit land here, and then you can go over a land route, which is the way that that trade has been done for, at this point, centuries. This is the Silk Road that takes you from China, other places in the east, over land until you get to Palestine or to ports on the seas up here. What happens in the 15th century is that the Turks seize what is today Turkey, and they make it significantly more difficult for people to get back and forth between India because they have their own economic interests and they want to protect their own sphere of influence. So in response to this, and essentially because of the conclusion that the Turks are going to be there in perpetuity, this is after several hundred years of crusades being fought against them to try to push them out of the Middle East. With their conquest of Asia Minor, it becomes clear that this is going to be a permanent thing and they're not going to be going away. So you need an alternate route to India, and that's what Columbus sets out to do. And of course, he ends up landing here in what's currently the Dominican Republic. He never actually sets foot in North America, but he is the first European to establish permanent territory for a European power in the Western Hemisphere. This is followed relatively quickly thereafter by the Portuguese, establishing their first continent in what's today Brazil. They also establish a colony in Asia around the same time, including their colony at Goa in South India. But they also establish ports all over the world, basically, but the main ones are in what's today Indonesia and in China at Macau. And then finally, in 1607, the British established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. So what are some of the... Why is this such an important historical moment? We've had imperialism and colonialism basically as long as we've had written history. And so why is this such a big deal? Any ideas? What are the concrete consequences of the establishment of European colonies in the Americas, other than just the acquisition of territory and ultimately, after a couple hundred years, the emergence of independent states? Yeah. Yeah, well, for one thing, there is the mix of cultures, which has tremendous impacts for both sides. For the European side, this is the importation of things that they haven't had before, tomatoes and potatoes and tobacco and chocolate and sugar. So, and the ability then to create markets on the basis of those things. This is called the Columbian Exchange, by the way. Right, so there's this notion that Italian food, is based on pasta as a staple, usually served in tomato sauce. That is something that colonialism made possible. because pasta came originally from China, which is just a matter of trade, but tomatoes come from North America and wouldn't have appeared in Europe without colonialism. How about on the American end of it? What are the effects there? Yeah.
Don't most of their natives lose their land?
They lose their land, yeah. What else do they lose?
Their freedom, like
They lose their freedom. Most significantly, what do they lose beyond those two things? About more than 90% of them lose their lives. And this happens quickly. So we don't know for sure how many people lived in the Western Hemisphere before the arrival of Europeans. I've seen estimates anywhere between, on the low end, 10 million, on the upper end, 100 million, but we don't know. We do know that within 25 years, 90% of them were dead. So, and this was not deliberate killing, by the way. This was disease that killed them. So if there's one single thing that fueled this process of the displacement and removal of these people that had previously been the inhabitants of these continents for, at least 10,000 years, the biggest thing was that we in Europe and in Asia had been cattle herders. That was sort of the big thing that made a difference. We'd been cattle herders. That had conferred upon us not immunity, but at least the ability of our immune systems to resist smallpox to a certain extent. The Indians didn't have that. And so when they got smallpox, they got the bad version and they died. And because nobody knew about the germ theory of disease, nobody really knew how to prevent it from being spread. Now that said, it was also highly exploitative, obviously. There was, and on top of it, there was just a significant amount of technological advancement on the part of Europeans that the people in the Americas had not undergone. So only a couple of cultures in the Americas had written languages. They didn't have steel. Steel making was a process that had been developed in the Middle East and then spread out from there because there had been no contact between these populations beforehand. To the extent that they had metalworking at all, it was crude, comparatively speaking, and nothing like the ability to alloy metals or anything like that and make weapons that were significantly more advanced. And of course, they didn't have gunpowder either, so they didn't have guns, and they didn't have, therefore, the ability to kill large numbers of people with significant ease. They also didn't have horses. We have this tendency to picture Native Americans on horseback. And oftentimes using guns, because that's an enduring image that we have, particularly in the United States, of the Lakota, the Sioux in the Great Plains, who were horsemen and who carried guns. But those are all European. None of that comes in until Europeans arrive. So it's just a matter of just incredibly mismatched opponents on the field of battle, in addition to this tremendous amount of susceptibility to disease that the Native Americans have. And this is hugely catastrophic for this population. On top of it, there's attempts to enslave the ones that are able to survive, but they resist quite strongly, and so that gives rise to conflict. And then there's sort of is no real sense among the Europeans of how much you can work a person and not feed them until they die. So that doesn't go particularly well for the Europeans either, which is one of the reasons why ultimately the Europeans decide that if they're going to institute slavery in the Western Hemisphere, their stock of slaves is going to have to come from Africa. Because for one thing, it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to move Native Americans from one place to another and have them survive, particularly to move them to the Caribbean where they're going to be building these plantations. But they can take Africans who come from basically the same latitudes around the equator, and they throw in the added plus in this that the ones that are strong enough to survive the trip over, which is a minority of them, have basically proved that they're probably strong enough to survive whatever you're going to throw at them next. So there's a lot of sort of overt cruelty that goes into this whole process, and it's not an accident that slavery follows very quickly on the heels of colonialism, of intercontinental colonialism in this particular way. And one of the things we'll talk about in the next class is the extent to which it's kind of a chicken and an egg question, the extent to which racism fuels these practices, or these practices, in order to be justified by the people that undertake them, give rise to racism as a result. And there's different, and opposing theories about this. But what is undeniably true is that what the colonists find is that subjecting people that are racially different from themselves is significantly more easy to do, for whatever reason, whether it's because they create racism to justify their cruelty, or that their racism that is already there justifies the cruelty that they subsequently undertake. The big push for the British, colonially speaking, other than North America, where of course they're we emerge independent in 1776, but their big colonial holding is never the United States in the Western Hemisphere. It's Canada, which they still have a much closer relationship to. Canada still is the in the British Commonwealth of Nations. They also have extensive holdings in the Caribbean, but their jewel in the crown, as they call it, outside of North America, is in India. They established their first colony there in 1625. They also established the Cape Colony in South Africa. And so what they do, as well as a lot of other maritime powers, countries that rely extensively on naval power for their well-being, is they'll just establish ports all along the coast of Africa. They'll establish permanent settlements in South Africa as a place to stop along the way. And this will make the issue of getting from up here in England all the way over here to India a lot easier. This relationship that Britain has with India begins to erode when Napoleon comes on the scene. Because what he does is he begins to assert French colonial desires within the regions that have traditionally been controlled by Great Britain, because Britain, remember, has the supreme naval force, and therefore any place that you're on the high seas, including in the Mediterranean, that's a place where British power is going to reign supreme, at least as far as Europe and the Atlantic is concerned. France invades Egypt, establishes a base of control there. They also begin to establish colonies in North Africa, most significantly the one in Algeria, which they hold until the 1950s. And then the extension of colonialism goes out to the Far East. So although the Portuguese have established colonies in what's currently China and Indonesia and also in India, they stick to ports by and large. With the Opium Wars, what happens is that the extension of British colonialism into Asia brings forth the realization that opium, which can be very easily grown in South Asia, that there's essentially a captive market for it already in China, because it's been used there culturally for centuries. And that if Britain can corner the market on opium, it's going to make them fantastically wealthy. It's also going to significantly handicap China's ability to compete with Great Britain. Remember when we talked about mill, I mentioned that until really the 18th or 19th century, China was the wealthiest country in the world. When, as a consequence of colonialism and its need to maintain its supreme sea power, England ultimately emerges as the most powerful country in the world in the 19th century. It very much subjects China as a part of that process, not just economically, but politically and militarily. There is also the emergence of the desire for political independence of the people, the native people of South Africa, with the first war against one of the tribes, the Zulus in South Africa, being fought in 1879. And again, because although the Zulus are significantly more advanced than the Native Americans have been, because they've been in contact with Europeans, they also have their own relatively advanced culture, being Bantu, which is the sort of the predominant language group in southern Africa, they nevertheless lack the kind of military sophistication that the British have, and so beating them is difficult, but ultimately is done. And what's decided in the 1880s among the European powers is that in order to solidify their control over the continent of Africa, they will divide what has not yet been conquered on the continent amongst themselves. So on the left, you have what Africa looks like in terms of its colonial settlement in 1880. What is pink is British. What is blue is French. What is green is the Ottomans. What is yellow is Spain. But as you can see, there's big portions of the Sahara, Central Africa, East Africa, and north of what becomes the Republic of South Africa are not colonized. Just before World War I begins, you can see that they have colonized the entire thing with the exception of Ethiopia. And this, which is called the Spanish Sahara, and there are Spanish ports in the northern part. This yellow here, which is what's today Equatorial Guinea, that's a Spanish colony. That's a Spanish colony. That's a Spanish colony. This other yellow here, though, that's Ethiopia. That's the only country that actually doesn't get colonized. And it doesn't get colonized on some level because of the belief among the Europeans that the Ethiopians are the most advanced civilization on the African continent, and therefore they treat them with a certain greater amount of respect than they do the rest of the continent. They base this on the fact that the Ethiopians have had written language for a couple thousand years. They're Christians on top of it, so that's a big vote in their favor. But ultimately, the Italians will attempt to colonize Ethiopia too, and they will be successful under Mussolini in the 1930s in doing that. So the entire continent is colonized. There are no independent states in Africa by the 1930s. And to be clear, I mean, Africa, first of all, is the second largest continent, and it is enormously resource rich, tremendously so. So just to give you some examples, like, in the south, there's diamonds and gold. In the Congo, there's rubber, and there are rare minerals. And here on the Atlantic coast, there's petroleum, most of which has not been exploited to any great extent. And so this will be a tremendous windfall for the colonial powers in Europe to begin to exploit these resources. But it will have some tremendously horrendous consequences, not the least of which is obviously just the subjection of the people. But in particular cases like the Belgian Congo, which is this purple here, it will be the major Belgian colony that's established in Africa. They will essentially just institute outright slavery with corporal and capital punishment in the whole 9 yards. And something that many scholars consider to have been just overtly genocidal going on there, mainly for the extraction of rubber from that country. And this is all justified not only by, well, it's justified in a couple ways. First of all, it's justified by just the profit that can be gotten from it. So that, in some ways, is its own justification. But beyond that, there's also the matter of it being racially justified, right? Like if these people that lived on this continent had, had our sort of quality as human beings, they would have developed these countries more than they already have. And so because they couldn't means that by virtue of our being better, we should. The flip side of that coin is something that they call the white man's burden, that it is, as a consequence of being colonizers, it is also incumbent on the colonizing power to civilize these countries, to Christianize them if possible, to institute Western forms of education, to build infrastructure in many cases, which ultimately does in fact benefit the people that live in these countries. But it's all done under a very paternalistic kind of view about the people that live there in the first place. Like they're not really adults. Even when the people that live there are adults, they can still basically be treated like children, because intellectually, from the standpoint of Europeans who are deeply invested in this undertaking, they are children. And so they can be, you don't have to worry about their consent or their whether or not they like what you're doing. They will benefit from it, and as a result, you are further justified in doing what you do. France also will colonize Southeast Asia. It will hold colonies in what's today Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It'll do that until the 1950s. As I mentioned, Italy will attempt to conquer Ethiopia, but will fail, and so it will be a couple generations later when they finally do. And then we get into the game in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. So we've been operating on the basis in the United States of something called the Monroe Doctrine. Anybody know what the Monroe Doctrine is? High school U.S. history? Come on, Monroe Doctrine. Your Monroe Doctrine is stated by President James Monroe and says that the United States does not accept the intervention of European powers in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. It's basically a statement of American supremacy in the West. So if a dispute arises between the United States and a country in Latin America, then it's up to the United States to solve that problem on its own without any intervention. Or for that matter, if the United States decides to intervene in a dispute between two countries in the Western Hemisphere that doesn't involve the United States, it can do that. And this is, it's laid down by the United States, and it's largely sort of laughed at by the European powers until the United States can really enforce it. By the time and Spain has colonies in the Caribbean, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then it also has its big Asian colonial holding in the Philippines. And basically, on the basis of an accident that happens in the harbor at Havana in Cuba, the United States invades Cuba, liberates it from the Spanish, liberates Puerto Rico, and liberates the Philippines, gives them independence in varying extents. Obviously, independence is not given to Puerto Rico. It's given to Cuba, but under American sort of protection. The Philippines we actually hold on to until the end of World War II. But this is our taking on of empire, basically. This is our taking on of territory outside of our borders. And we justify it differently. We say basically that this is we are doing it to free them from the yoke of Spanish imperialism. But we're just sort of trading one foreign yoke for another. And the desire for Americans to have these territories is, by and large, not economic, but military. It's to extend the American military power beyond the borders of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And that is both to facilitate the making of war should that need arise, but much more importantly in this point historically, to protect the United States from being attacked, to maintain our neutrality and isolation more than anything else. So it's going to be a lot better for us, we figure, if we've got islands out in the Caribbean where we can ward off an attack before it gets to our shores. Hawaii, for us, will very much serve that purpose, but with regard to possible aggression from China and Japan, particularly from China, the Philippines will serve that particular role. So one more thing to point out about British rule in India is, so when we have our Civil War in the 1860s, it presents a serious problem for the British, because the British in 1860s are still getting their cotton from the southern United States. And now we have this problem where, and so a major trading partner of the South is, and therefore, afterward of the Confederacy, is the UK. And they can do that because, again, they have a powerful navy that can protect their shipping and all of that. But what we begin doing is attacking that shipping as a way of destroying the southern economy when the Civil War begins. And although the British are able to survive this, it becomes too costly for them ultimately to begin to rely on the United States South for cotton. On top of this, they've already abolished slavery in the British Empire, and they are perfectly aware of two things. First of all, that it's likely the North will win the Civil War, A, and B, when that happens, slavery will be abolished and their labor costs will go up significantly in the United States South. They need a solution to this problem because one of their largest industries is textiles. Right? But they can't grow cotton in the UK because it doesn't have the climate. India will solve that problem for them rather nicely because not only does it have the climate where they can grow cotton, but it has much cheaper labor because the cost of living in India is much cheaper. The problem is that it's very costly to get from here all the way around to here. So does anybody know what they do to solve that problem? They dig a canal right here, Suez Canal. And that becomes their very large contribution to international trade, but of course it's done to facilitate their own ability to get back and forth to India. Now, the UK's been in India at this point for a couple hundred years, but it's really going to sink its teeth in at this point. And so very much in the example of necessity being the mother of invention, when it becomes necessary to maintain this very lucrative trade in textiles for the British to dig the Suez Canal, they do it. And then subsequently, they will entrench themselves militarily in India in a way that they have not up until this point. They will claim that they are doing this mainly because there has been the beginnings of resistance to British colonial rule in India to a limited extent. But really, it's to maintain this trade back and forth between these territories, mainly between India. So now, Britain doesn't even need the mills that it's had for hundreds of years in its own country because the labor is much, much cheaper in South Asia, in what ultimately becomes India and Pakistan. We'll talk about Gandhi in a couple of weeks, and when we do, he points out quite rightly that one key, I should say, to the Indians getting independence from the United Kingdom is liberating themselves from the mills where they're employed. Unless they can free themselves from British textiles, they will never free themselves from Britain. The control is as importantly economically for them as it is militarily and certainly politically. And that's why one of Gandhi's sort of big lessons that he teaches everybody that will listen to him is that they need to be able to spin their own clothes. And why, for instance, if you know the flag of modern-day India, it is a spinning wheel in the center for precisely that reason. That message from Gandhi about self-reliance and not relying on colonial textiles. So, the reading for today is from George Orwell, who you probably have heard of because he wrote Animal Farm in 1984. He wrote a lot more than that, and the vast majority of what he wrote was not on the subject of Soviet totalitarianism. So he is British himself. He's actually born in what's today Bangladesh, and his father is an imperial police officer, but he's sent back home to the UK to go to school, and then when he finishes school, he enrolls in the Burmese police force. So Burma, what's today Myanmar, is also part of the British rule in South Asia at that time. It goes as far west as Pakistan and as far east as the border with Thailand. So that when those countries finally become independent, there's 4 or 5 of them altogether. In the 1930s, he travels to Spain and fights in the Spanish Civil War. And it is when he returns after being wounded that he publishes this essay that we'll look at today, Shooting an Elephant. Animal Farm and 1984 are among the last 2 things that he publishes. His concern here being that that Soviet-style communism will sort of ruin the future of socialism for Europe, because he is a deeply committed socialist, but he is a democratic socialist, and therefore believes that what Soviet totalitarianism has done to the reputation and potential good of socialism is maybe the worst thing that the world is going to be facing after World War II. So the reading is on page 684 of your book. So please turn there. So as noted, he serves as a colonial police officer in Burma, where he says he was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in his life that he's ever been important enough to be hated, he says. And that, of course, it was the Burmese that hated him. And that this hatred that he experienced at the hands of the Burmese, it knew essentially no limit in terms of the people whose station in life among the Burmese might have ranged anywhere from the bottom of day laborers to the top, which in Burma would be the Buddhist monks. All of them, he says, hate him. And he says this is confusing to him because he'd already actually made up his mind that he was going to leave. He was going to leave the colonial police force. And he says, and this is the second paragraph on 684, he explains why. And this is 3 lines into the second paragraph on 684. Theoretically and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters. The wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the gray, cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who have been flogged with bamboos. All these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. So there's this contrast that he makes immediately in this essay between sort of the larger conception that British people have of colonialism, which is the economic benefit for Great Britain, which is enormous, and then, but more importantly, the kind of the public back in England, their conception of the white man's burden, that they are truly making life better for the people in these countries. What they don't appreciate, if they're even aware of it, is the extent to which there's actual resistance to what they're doing. They know about it by this point, in 1936, they know about it at least in India, because with the emergence of Gandhi, it's become an international issue. But that actually has the knock-on effect of pushing other independence activists sort of off the front page. So, you know, England has colonies all over the world. It is quite literally, as they call it, the empire on which the sun never sets. And so India, while its most valuable colony at this point certainly, does not make up a majority or even a plurality of its landmass. And it has subjected people of all races. As such, the fact that the big story in anti-colonialism in the British Empire is Gandhi means that for the Burmese, their resistance, if it's even acknowledged, is seen as minor. And he says, well, the real fact of colonialism is this underlying mechanism of force. Because the use of actual force, or at least the threat of force, has to be there in order to be a minority ruling over a majority, that means people get hurt. And people get thrown in jails, and they are not afforded the same rights that you would afford to a white person under those same conditions back in the UK. That in and of itself is an important kind of paradox that emerges with regard to colonialism when it's practiced by Europeans. So we've talked quite a bit in this course about how by the 18th century, the majority of countries in Central and Western Europe are transitioning or have fully transitioned to liberal democracies of some kind. They might not have established universal suffrage, but they've at least expanded male suffrage outside of the moneyed classes. Britain, remember, establishes a Bill of Rights in 1689. It limits the power of the monarch significantly. There's elections in Great Britain with the prime minister and the whole 9 yards. But as they are democratizing to that very great extent in the UK, they are expanding colonial rule and they are ignoring democratic principle in doing so. And that is the real paradox that never is sort of considered by those people outside of the colonial enterprise, because the vast majority of the people who live in Great Britain have no direct interaction with colonialism whatsoever. It's not like there are colonial subjects living in the UK. There are not. It is still a majority, it is still a uniformly white country. It's just that it has all of this tremendous wealth. But that is not foremost in the consciousness of the people in the UK. And he says that although he is aware of the injustice of colonialism, he says he can't sort of get it foremost in his mind and keep it there because, as he says, he was young and ill-educated, and had had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. I did not even know that the British Empire is dying. Still less did I know that it is a great deal better than the younger empires that are going to supplant it. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj. The Raj is what they call British rule over South Asia, as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down in secula seculorum upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. Feelings like these are the normal byproducts of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you can catch him off duty. So this is his introduction before he even begins telling the story that he has to convey here. And that's very significant because he introduces in doing this theme, which is that there's a lot of attention paid in the treatment of colonialism about how unfair it is to the people that are being colonized, and that is undeniably true, and undeniably the greater injustice is done to them. It is also true, however, he says, that colonialism has the effect as well of doing something quite negative to the people that do the colonizing. So it, despite all of the well-intentioned ideas about white man's burden and bringing civilization to the unwashed masses and so on and so forth, it has the real effect of making you hate the people that you rule over. Because after all, it is their natural response to being dominated to resist, and it is your natural reaction to their resistance, because it takes the form often of violence, for your reaction to be violent. That's human. So one of the things that Orwell does in this essay is make clear that there is great danger that is done to the colonizers by virtue of engaging in this process. It's a given that the process of colonialism dehumanizes the colonized. But he says it dehumanizes the colonizer as well because it removes the colonizer's ability to be kind and sympathetic and have the feelings that are supposed to distinguish people from lower forms of life. It makes people cruel, and that's a potentially much more dangerous kind of negative effect. And then he begins telling the story. There's this elephant that is that has an attack of must, he says. This is middle paragraph on 685. It had been chained up as tame elephants always are when their attack of must is due, but on the previous night it had broken its chain and escaped. What is must? Why does the elephant break loose? One of the things about your book is to keep the cost relatively, and I say relatively, cheaper. They don't have footnotes to tell you what this means. So it's in heat. That's why it breaks out. It's looking to mate, and so it breaks out and kills somebody's cow, raids some fruit stalls and devours the stock, and also met the municipal rubbish van, and when the driver jumped out and took to its heels, had turned the van over and inflicted violences upon him. So this report of this wild elephant comes to the police department office, and it is our narrator's job to neutralize this elephant because it's dangerous, and their job as the colonial police force is not just to protect the business of colonialism, but it is to keep public order, like any police force's job is. So he grabs his gun, and they go out, and he has some difficulty finding the elephant. But most importantly, he sees that the elephant has killed somebody. This is on 686. It's about 7 lines from the top. I rounded the hut and saw a dead man's body sprawling in the mud. He was an Indian, a black Dravidian coolie, almost naked, and he could not have been dead many minutes. The people said that the elephant had come suddenly upon him, round the corner of the hut, caught him with its trunk, put his foot on his back, and ground him into the earth. So the elephant has killed somebody, a black Dravidian coolie. What is a Dravidian? Anyone? A Dravidian is a southern Indian. So from the southern part of India, of the Indian subcontinent, the languages are different, and people tend to be darker skinned as well, as opposed to the northern parts where the languages they speak are much more closely related to the languages spoken in Europe, and their skin tends to be somewhat lighter. So you can tell that he's a coolie. Anyone? Coolie? Coolie is a physical labor, usually a dark-skinned physical labor. It is a term of abuse. You don't use that word to describe somebody if you're trying to be value neutral in your describing of them. It's not quite the N-word, but it definitely has racially denigrating and class denigrating aspects to it. So understand that the person that the elephant kills is at the bottom of the social ladder. He's not Burmese, for one thing. He is Indian. He is South Indian, and therefore, even among Indians, he is in the lower levels. And he's a physical laborer on top of it. So class-wise, he's at the very bottom, too. But it is Orwell's decision that he must therefore kill the elephant, because an elephant that has killed a human being has to be put down. That's the sort of the conventional way. Which, by the way, just sort of brings up an important kind of consideration, which is, does an animal that kills somebody have to be killed? Do you ever see those? Do you ever see those TV programs where they've got like the people that like live with a tiger? You know that there are more tigers in captivity, or sorry, living in homes in Texas than there are in all of the zoos combined all over the world, because their laws about living with a tiger are, they're lax. So, and I watch these television programs, and I think to myself, this is going to end, badly for somebody, and probably not the tiger, right? Because it's a tiger, and if you don't feed it, and it needs, like close to 100 pounds of meat every day, which is expensive. Then it's going to eat you, because it's It's an apex predator, right? It's a carnivore, and it might like you, but it also is going to get hungry. So should you kill the tiger that eats the idiot that decided he wanted to live with the tiger? What for? He's being a tiger. He's doing exactly what tigers do. Elephants are tameable, but not really domesticable. And so there's some question, I think, as to whether it's truly a just thing to just, in principle, kill an animal that's still a human being, particularly when it's an animal that can very easily kill a human being, like an elephant, because elephants are enormous. So, but here's the issue. The issue is that by the time he actually tracks the elephant down, the elephant is clearly no longer a danger, and he hesitates as to whether he should kill it or not. But he does. And so the question is, why does he kill the elephant? I mean, and it's probably not a huge like spoiler at that point, because you've already read the title of the essay, which is Shooting an Elephant, right? But he does in fact shoot the elephant, and he kills it. And so the question is, well, if he recognizes that when he finds the elephant that it's no longer a danger, and he doesn't want to shoot the elephant, then why does he shoot the elephant? He says, in fact, page 688, I did not want to shoot the elephant. I watched him beating his bunch of grass against his knees with that preoccupied, grandmotherly air that elephants have. It seemed to me that it would be murder to shoot him. At that age, I was not squeamish about killing animals, but I had never shot an elephant and never wanted to. Somehow it always seemed worse to kill a large animal. He says, besides that, you know, it's got an owner, and it's valuable. It does work for the guy. So why does he kill it? Leave your hand up.
Does he feel pressure, though?
Yeah, he feels tremendously pressured by the Burmese who are standing behind him, who have been following him up to this point with his rifle, and who expect him to kill this elephant. Now, their expectations come from any number of different places. There are some of them that just want the meat off the elephant. There are some of them that you know, have sort of like begun to taste blood and want to see something get killed. You know, they have that kind of that comes from that same place that people who like will slow down when they pass an accident. But there also is no small number of them who just want to see him be made a fool of, and who maybe want to see him get trampled as well, because again, you know, they hate him. So what he brings up about doing this has something to do with the matter of what being part of the colonial enterprise does to his free will. So it's not just a matter that the process of colonialism turns the colonizer into something cruel and less than human in terms of being able to empathize and feel badly about doing bad things. But it's also that it actually strips the colonizer of his free will. And again, that is counterintuitive, because clearly the process of colonialism strips the colonized person of his or her free will. Given their druthers, they would prefer to be free of colonial rule. And therefore, we make the presumption that the person who is colonizing, and therefore every person that is involved in that process of colonization, from the Prime Minister of England right down to the lowliest member of the colonial police force, as Orwell here is, bears some responsibility in the process, and therefore is part of this group of people who are freely exercising their will. And Orwell says that's a mistake. that the process not only has this process of dehumanizing the colonizer, but it even strips you of the sort of the most basic aspect of being human in a larger kind of moral and philosophical sense. It takes away your ability to freely think. He doesn't kill the elephant because he wants to or because he has to. He kills it because he doesn't want to be made a fool of. And that's not a good enough reason. which he acknowledges. And then on top of it, when he shoots the elephant, it takes forever to die. He says he finds out only later, after he has shot it several times with an elephant gun, and then on top of that, he's taken a machine gun and shot it for several dozen rounds. The thing is still alive. A couple of you, three of you have been in my literature class. So what do we call that? What is that? What is that literary device that he is relying on in creating this elephant that will not die? We might call it a metaphor. We might say that the elephant is in some ways symbolic, particularly that the elephant is symbolic of colonialism itself. Now, there's some question that has arisen over the course of several years as to whether or not this story actually happened. Some people have gone back over the records among the colonial police force in Burma, trying to find some record for it, and there is no record of it there. So the question then becomes, well, so he wrote a story. He wrote other stories. What's the big deal? He was a novelist as well as an essayist and a nonfiction writer. So why present this as fact when he could have just presented it as a story? And the answer is I don't know, except that maybe it gives it a little bit greater gravity for the people reading it, for them to think that this is something that he actually saw. Did you want to comment? No. Okay. But yeah, so it's but it ends up being this sort of particularly before World War II, when the battle with the Indian independence movement is well underway, and it will, within 3 years after the time that this essay is published, World War II will begin, and therefore the whole sort of issue of Indian independence will take a back seat. But when he writes in 1936, there is significant attention being paid to the issue of British colonialism, in part at least because sort of one of the things that has happened as a result of the end of World War I, of course, is the collapse of these hundreds of year old empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the German Empire, but they're just replaced with other empires that just impose their own form of imperialism and colonialism on these liberated territories. And so if World War I is this war that is designed to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, then why doesn't that democracy extend to territories outside of Europe? And in justifying this, the answer, unfortunately, can only be, to some extent, racial, and to the remainder of the extent, economic, but certainly not moral. And so there's increasing pressure being placed on the British to either justify in some substantive way their project of colonization or to get rid of it. And World War II rather just, takes that issue and gets rid of it. But as soon as the war is over, the Indians will begin to press rather heavily for their independence. And then once that is gotten, India, or rather the African colonies, will follow soon thereafter. So I'm going to stop here for women, and then I'm going to need to give you the actual numbers in a minute. So the 17th Amendment, popular election of senators. 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. 23rd Amendment, presidential electors for the District of Columbia. But since I forgot it, 24th Amendment, abolition of the poll tax, and 26th Amendment, lowering of the voting age to 18. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you go over between a democracy and a republic?
So a democracy and a republic, they are not mutually exclusive. That sort of is the most important thing to understand. So you can have a democracy and have it not be a republic. So a democracy, remember, democracy means where power is held by the people. And that very often what is associated with that is elections. A republic is a political form where the state is considered to be like owned by the people. And really sort of the distinction is between a republic and some other form of a state like a monarchy or a dictatorship. And you can have a monarchy and a democracy, or you can have a republic and a democracy, or you can have a monarchy or a republic without democracy. But there is some necessary association between a republic being truly a republic, a thing of the people, and there being democracy. Other countries can call themselves republics, but the extent to which they are truly republics is debatable. So we would probably say that North Korea, despite it calling itself a republic, is flat out probably not really a republic. We would say that Iran is much closer to being a republic, comparatively speaking, but that nevertheless, because it has things like a supreme ruler who comes from the clerical class, and because it's heavily influenced by religion, that it's not a republic to the extent that, for instance, the United States is, where it is, at least in theory, fully something that is owned and run by the people. Yes?
Do we have to know about how democracy works in America, like with the Electoral College and all that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. So I would say that it's important for you to understand mainly that there is an electoral college and that it stands in the way of there being more immediate and direct democracy, right? So it's much more important for you to know that, probably the most important thing for you to know is that, 2 of the last 3 presidents weren't elected by the majority, when that 5 of the 45 were not elected by a majority. And that, therefore, the extent, and that's actually sort of a good point about making this distinction between a republic and a democracy. In a pure democracy, with no no aspects of, as we call it here, a constitutional republic, you wouldn't have something like that. You would just have a majority rule. But because we've got a constitutional form of a republic that sets out rules like having an electoral college, it means that democracy does not always play out in the manner that we would otherwise expect. And then beyond that, it's important to understand why we had an electoral college put in there in the first place, right? So it's a desire to offset the power of the federal and state governments, and that really anywhere that the state governments are being more greatly empowered, it's being done to placate the southern slave-owning states. Yeah?
Can you give a general statement towards the essays? Anything about them?
They will be on the topic of democracy. As I said before, that there will be one that will be relatively broad, and then another that will be more specific. Yeah.
It's got 5 paragraphs.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Could you go over the rule of law?
The rule of law. So the rule of law states that that society is governed by law and not by people. Right. So some of the assumptions of the rule of law, for instance, are that the law applies equally to everybody, that it can't be arbitrarily applied in some cases and ignored in other cases. I mean, that's really sort of all the rule of law is the idea that rather than individual people making decisions about what is going to be allowed and what is not going to be allowed, that a pre-existing law is applied and interpreted consistently in all cases. Yes?
And then, in terms of, like, the history of Rome, do you want us to, like, know specific dates, or just, like...
No, you don't have to know specific dates. The main thing that you should know about Roman history is just that it was a republic, and that it ultimately became a monarchy, the Roman Empire, by virtue of the the economic and military power accrued to Caesar. Yes?
What's the key point with the Italian history?
The main thing about the Italian history is to understand the emergence of nationalism in Italy and Germany, as well as in Serbia, and then subsequently, or not subsequently, but sort of also fourthly in the Zionist movement. What is sort of special about the cases of Italy and Germany are that these are cases in which nationalism becomes fascist in the 20th century. And so, now nationalism doesn't always become fascist, but you should have some ability to understand the conditions that would make it likelier rather than less likely. Other questions? Yes?
Could you just explain what we need to know about the Jewish state in 1895?
So, the main thing about, well, so it's the context there is Zionism or Jewish nationalism. And so but the reading there is is from the Jewish State by Theodor Herzl. The main thing to know about that is that he suggests that nationalism is the only solution for the problem of European anti-Semitism, and that he proposes it essentially as a colonial undertaking, that a Jewish state in Palestine would be a bulwark against of European civilization against Asia. Other questions? Any? Okay. Off you go. I will see you on Thursday for your second quiz.